Many Spaniards have no idea of who the forgotten heroes who rest beneath this gravestone are. Buried in the cemetery of La Florida are some of the people of Madrid who gave their lives in 1808 so that this city might become the capital of a free nation. Years later, we search for answers. What was it that unleashed the fury of an entire city? What role did the monarchy play? What happened at the doors of the royal palace and on the streets of Madrid? What moved those men and women to rise up against the French invaders? This is the story of a city that fought for its freedom. Whoa! On the morning of May 2nd, 1808, the city awakes following the festival of San Isidro el Verde, the popular pilgrimage held in honor of the patron saint of Madrid. Shopkeepers and artisans get ready for another day of work. In the past, this celebration has been joyful and lively. But this year, the tension in the city is palpable. The people of Madrid are as upset as they are perplexed. Ever since French troops arrived in the city on March 23rd, there has been much unease among the locals. In spite of the 170,000 people who live here, this morning the streets are nearly deserted. Citizens of Madrid are being forced to live side by side with French troops. The monarchy is an institution in crisis. Carlos IV and Fernando VII are in Bayonne Palace in France, the prisoners of Napoleon. Only 3 members of the royal family remain in their palace in Madrid: Princess Maria Luisa, Queen of Etruria, Prince Antonio, and Prince Francisco de Paula. But rumors abound that today they too will be taken to France. At 8 o'clock in the morning, drums announce the changing of the guard at the capital's military barracks. Meanwhile, the first small groups of people start to gather. The usual bums and vagrants are there, but they're being joined by agitators who have been trying to turn the locals against the French for days now. They don't seem to be organized, but in fact, it will be quite easy to convince others to join their cause.
The news reached the people through the press. At the time, there were only 2 newspapers in Madrid, El Diario de Madrid and La Gaceta de Madrid. But most people found out by word of mouth, due to an extremely high illiteracy rate. A huge number of common people did not know how to read.
At the royal palace, outside the door known as the Puerta de Príncipe, a carriage awaits. Another carriage has already set out for France, carrying the Queen of Etruria at daybreak. Protected by the royal guard, palace footmen make last-minute preparations for the voyage Prince Francisco de Paula is about to take. He is the last remaining member of the royal family in Madrid. So absorbed in their work are they, that the guards do not notice the arrival of a group of agitators. They burst onto the esplanade armed with picks, shovels, and rakes. The guards are unable to keep the mob from surrounding the carriage. Their screams and threats become more and more violent. Just then, under the cover of chaos, another group of agitators manages to enter the palace, reaching a sitting room where they find the prince himself. Francisco de Paula, with a serenity beyond his years, calms the men down. Meanwhile, outside the palace, the first shouts are heard from the people. Traitors! They've already taken our king. Death to the French. In an effort to calm things down, the prince appears on a balcony, and the people below beg him not to leave. For a moment, it seems as though the situation is not going to worsen, but nothing could be further from the truth. The revolt has begun.
The situation in Spain, and particularly in Madrid, where the king and his court were located, was a state of chaos, because who was in charge? Carlos IV had left, so had Fernando VII. There was a general sense of unrest. The French were camped out surrounding Madrid. French generals and marshals were going after what they wanted. There was a feeling of unease. There had been lots of small flare-ups between locals and the French. And the last straw was when the rumor began to circulate that the prince and princess, the last remaining members of the royal family, were going to be taken away.
In the first moments of the revolt, groups of men and women throw themselves on the imperial soldiers. All over the city, the hunt for the French begins. Anyone with enough spirit and strength attacks the first Frenchman he sees. The people's fury and rage boils over. Surprised by this aggression, the French run to their barracks for cover. News of the scuffle reaches General Murat, Grand Duke of Berg, commander of the French forces that occupy Madrid. He responds with a show of force. At first, soldiers under Colonel Lagrange, Murat's confidant, try to snuff out the riot, but they are met with more attacks by the locals. The reaction of the most powerful army in the world is tremendous. The Grenadier Battalion of the Imperial Guard, along with a squadron of Polish hunters, storm the palace esplanade and open fire on the civilians without warning. The unexpected attack succeeds in breaking up the mob, but the insurrection is broken out, and there is nothing that can stop it.
The uprising of May 2nd was effectively a spontaneous uprising. To a good extent, it was a chaotic uprising, an uprising with little preparation, although it had been simmering with tension because of standoffs with the French.
As with all revolutionary movements, there was an aspect of persuasion. There was a breeding ground. But of course, the spontaneity of the 2nd of May is indisputable.
In Spain, there was a, shall we say, national conscience, which led to a consideration of the French as usurpers who had to be stopped.
What happened was that, naturally, those who rose up had no idea what they were starting. But then, when the Bastille was attacked on July the 14th, 1789, the agitators there didn't know they were starting the French Revolution.
But how had it gotten to this point? 1 year earlier, in 1807, nearly all of Europe was already living under French imperial rule. Only England held out. Following the French and Spanish defeat in the Battle of Trafalgar, the English Navy took control of the seas. In Spain, the kingdom of Carlos IV has reached a low point. With the destruction of its fleet, commerce with America cut off, and unending funds going to support an alliance with France, the Spanish political situation does not look good. In order to defeat England, Napoleon orders that all European ports remain closed to British ships, but Portugal refuses to cooperate. In the Palace of Fontainebleau, Bonaparte is about to force Spain to sign a treaty allowing imperial troops to cross Spanish territory to invade Portugal. In exchange for permission to cross the country and for military aid, the treaty provides for the distribution of Portugal as spoils of war. The Algarve, which comprises a full third of this land, will serve as payment for Spanish Prime Minister Manuel Godoy. Godoy signs the treaty and seals his fate. But even worse, he puts King Carlos IV, his protector, in the eye of a political hurricane which will end his reign. As for Napoleon, this is his first step towards conquering the Iberian Peninsula.
The arrival of imperial troops was possible under the protection of the latest in an endless series of accords between Napoleon and the Spanish court, the Treaty of Fontainebleau, sanctioned October 27, 1807. And the first French military corps crossed the border headed towards Portugal, as dictated by a strategy called the Continental Blockade, which had been drawn up several months earlier by Napoleon. It came to signify the path the war took over the territory, and to a greater or lesser extent, both on land and at sea, it meant an economic war.
At this point in history, Spain was a country divided into various power-wielding factions. Pro-French and absolutist groups played the most significant role in the political and social situation. Inside Bodin, the oldest restaurant in the world, memories still linger in the air. Here, heirs to the Enlightenment gathered to discuss a modern Spain in line with their enlightened ideas. Most members of the intellectual class, which included such figures as Goya, Jovellanos, and Moratín, were eager to see the kind of change that took place in France following the Revolution of 1789.
Napoleon's invasion cut short all of the reforms that had been occurring in Spain throughout the 18th century. And what's worse, it divided the educated class. It divided the enlightened elite. Some of them immediately formed part of what was known at the time as the Spanish Resistance, and others came to be known as pro-French. Those who followed King Joseph were called disloyal, Josefinos, or traitors. But the lines are not completely clear.
Well, in the civil sphere, there was also a group of people who sympathized with the enlightened world, which had actually been around for several decades. They understood Napoleon's messages to have a double meaning. On the one hand, intellectual communion, but on the other hand, emotional confrontation. They were patriots, and when the conflict broke out, in many cases they identified more with their Spanish side than they did with their intellectual obligations.
When the brutality of the uprising, or Spanish reactionism, is sometimes insisted upon, we must remember that at that time Napoleon was an imperialist. He had very little to do with an enlightened France or with the opening up that took place there in 1789.
The pro-French are opposed by the absolutists, supporters of a traditional sovereignty and followers of the Prince of Asturias, the future Fernando VII. This group has the support of a large part of the aristocracy, the church, and even some commoners. These uneducated workers are easily influenced by the most powerful sectors. On October 18, 1807, in accordance with the terms agreed to at Fontainebleau, General Junot's troops crossed into Spain on their way to Lisbon. 3 months later, 3 more French military corps crossed the Pyrenees. The correspondence maintained between Napoleon, his high command, and the Spanish royal family makes it clear that the emperor has been harboring other plans beyond the annexation of Portugal, and has no intention of abandoning Spain. But in spite of the evidence at hand, Carlos IV continues to consider the French army an ally. Other historical documents speak of the progressive loss of prestige experienced by the Spanish government. Distrust for the crown grows. The economic situation puts the population on the brink of hunger. The people of Madrid feel that they are the victims of a swindle. And followers of Fernando VII take the opportunity to pin the responsibility on Manuel Godoy. The conspiracy under Fernando VII would come to a head between the 17th and 19th of March with the ousting of Godoy in the Mutiny of Aranjuez. Under cover of night, a furious mob makes its way through the streets near the royal country home. Supporters of the Prince of Asturias have recruited armed men from every corner of the region. They attack Godoy's palace screaming, "Death to the traitor." Manuel Godoy manages to remain hidden for 2 days. At daybreak on the 19th, he is taken prisoner and delivered to Fernando VII, the Prince of Asturias, who orders him to be jailed to await trial. As of this moment, and until April 21st, Manuel Godoy, the all-powerful minister of Carlos IV, will remain shut away in the castle of Villaviciosa. He will be released only to leave Spain, never to return.
The unpopularity of Manuel Godoy had reached such an extraordinary level that news that he had been captured at Aranjuez and that Fernando VII was the new king was met with a wave of enthusiasm.
On that very day, March the 19th, faced with conspiracy plots and the roar of the people, Carlos IV signs his renunciation to the throne and abdicates in favor of his heir. Fernando VII will reign for less than 2 months. Meanwhile, the French siege is closing in on Madrid. On March 23rd, 4 days after the Mutiny of Aranjuez, French troops enter Madrid under the command of Murat. In addition, 30,000 French soldiers still posing as allies set up camp in the small towns that surround Madrid. For locals, this is clearly a foreign army moving freely about their country.
The observation corps of Gironde under General Dupont were spread around the outskirts of Madrid. There were various divisions. One division was between Toledo and Aranjuez, another was stationed between Aranjuez and Pinto, and another between Pinto and Fuencarral. There were also cavalry units occupying some of the towns on the outskirts of Madrid, Carabanchel, Leganés, and the other observation corps on the coasts nearest to Madrid. The corps under Marshal Moncey had troops in the village of Chamartín and also on the road between El Pardo and Fuencarral. The rest had already entered Madrid or were very nearby.
From the first moment following the logical expectations that came with the arrival of French troops in Madrid, the relationship between the soldiers and the locals was difficult, which is what happens in all such situations around the world. People were afraid that prices would go up because of a rise in demand. They were afraid that there would be a shortage of provisions. And of course, there were rivalries in determined areas where they lived side by side, in taverns and other public places between civilians, and these soldiers who were continually viewed as foreigners. They seemed less and less like allies and more like an occupying force, which led to a kind of tension resulting in the death of 6 French soldiers in a variety of fights during the last week of March.
Predicting possible friction between locals and French troops, the authorities make their first announcement in Madrid, requesting that people take in the invaders as friends. Nothing can prevent these altercations. The General Hospital of Madrid would have to outfit several rooms in order to attend to soldiers wounded in street scuffles.
Que dichas tropas en el tiempo que permanezcan en Madrid y sus contornos sean tratadas como lo son del íntimo aliado de su majestad, con toda la franqueza, amistad.
The Spanish authorities order the people of Madrid to invite imperial officers to stay in their own homes. In spite of hostile feelings, many Frenchmen will be saved by their hosts during the uprising. Napoleon's army is made up of a variety of elite units, all with experience fighting important battles. There are also replacement forces. Cuirassiers, grenadiers, Mamelukes, and dragoons are all immaculately dressed in uniforms with bearskin helmets, shining cuirass armor, and panther skin turbans. They are armed with pistols, rifles, blunderbusses, sabers, and bayonets. As they parade before the multitudes, they are looked upon with a mixture of amazement and fear. The press of the time, the French Moniteur Universal and La Gaceta in Madrid, are being deftly directed from a base in Paris. Both speak of jubilation among the Spanish people. Actually, the reality on the street is quite different. It would be caricatures that would convey the real feelings of Spaniards. They appear as an audacious instrument for struggle in a time of censorship, using satire, fear, indignation, and the courage of the Spanish people as tools of reflection. More than ever, the people need a king who represents the interests of the nation.
Fernando VII swayed public opinion such that he came to be seen as a kind of beacon of hope, like a sort of redemptive messiah come to cure all of Spain's ills.
On March 24th, Fernando VII returns to Madrid as King of Spain. Popular enthusiasm spills forth, and bells ring out all over the city. Fernando VII, el deseado, the desired, has arrived.
Talking about Fernando VII is torture for most historians. That character who was Fernando VII, full of contradictions, cowardly, indecisive, but power-hungry. And we can't forget that the first coup d'etat was committed against his own parents.
On April 10th, King Fernando leaves Madrid to meet with Napoleon. The meeting is to take place in Burgos, then in Vitoria, and finally in Bayonne. The people of Madrid are present as the new monarch takes his leave, in search of the support and acknowledgement of Napoleon. Several days later, on April 21st, another party sets out for Bayonne. Carlos IV, his wife Maria Luisa, and Manuel Godoy, whose freedom has been secured by General Murat. Both Carlos IV and Fernando VII believe that they have Napoleon's support. But the emperor has already decided that the next king of Spain would be his own brother, Joseph Bonaparte. Fernando VII's visit to Bayonne is an absolute failure. The young king doesn't seem to have much choice but to carry out Napoleon's plans.
As he headed toward Bayonne, he probably experienced a lot of different feelings: fear, opportunism, a bit of self-deception in the sense that what they wanted was to have Napoleon act as a mediator. But it is known that once he reached Bayonne and stood before Napoleon, Fernando VII wasn't exactly brave, no. There was even a moment during the war when he actually congratulated Napoleon for the victories he had won over the Spanish people.
The royal family's time in Bayonne stretches out into a prolonged period of exile that will last 6 years. Spain's situation is desperate. The French army is based in Madrid, and the Regent's Council appointed by Fernando VII to govern in his absence is nothing more than a toy in the hands of General Murat. The age-old differences between Godoy, Carlos IV, and Fernando VII lead to a dead-end situation in which they are forced to back down. In the end, the ephemeral King Fernando returns the crown to his father, who in turn hands the kingdom over to the emperor. Napoleon's plans have come through. All that remains is for General Murat to receive orders to complete the invasion of Spain by taking Madrid.
I don't think Fernando VII was totally misled. I don't know if he had any other choice faced with Napoleon, the owner of Europe and the owner of, as he put it, the great army he had at his disposal, the most important army in the world. I think he was going to be taken prisoner and that he would remain in that condition for several years. I don't think he was tricked, but that he knew he had no other choice with the emperor.
This series of events leads to the unavoidable outbreak of violence on May 2nd, when Madrid becomes a battlefield. Every square and every corner is the site of a standoff to the death between the French and the Spanish. But the imperial troops, efficient and well-equipped, are taken by surprise by a multitude of exasperated men and women unleashing the hate that has been building up for weeks. people take to the streets trying to prevent the submission of Spain. Every round of gunfire is met with the slashing of knives and the throwing of stones. The number of victims grows quickly. 200 years later, there are still those who wonder if the outbreak of violence was totally spontaneous. But however it came to be, the death of hundreds of people in the streets of Madrid has been interpreted from as many different angles as there were factions, parties, and interests gambling for the destiny of Spain on that May morning.
Visto desde Francia,
from the French point of view, the uprising or mutiny or insurrection of May 2nd could not be interpreted as a spontaneous show of popular heroism or temperamental nobility.
Una nobleza temperamental.
So concealing that possible aspect pointed to a conspiracy. And that conspiracy was attributed to a somewhat undefined entity called the Fernando Party, or Party of Fernando, as he expressed in a letter he sent.
What is really significant is that the 2nd of May was a qualitative jump from the violence that had been flaring up periodically between Spanish civilians and French soldiers to a standoff between two established entities, the people of Madrid and the French army.
Of note is the contrast between the utilization and interpretation in France of the 2nd and 3rd of May. I mean, it was a conspiracy that was pretty ugly, despicable, of low quality. And yet in Spain, it was immediately exploited to boost patriotic and monarchical fervor. And this gave the impression that the Spanish people had revolted, had been awakened through this small group of local insurgents in the capital.
The Spanish army has orders not to intervene. But at the artillery headquarters, Captain Pedro Velarde decides to act. He takes the street toward the barracks at Mejorada. Along the way, he meets the volunteer battalion led by Andrés Rovira, which includes Lieutenant Ruiz, Captain Goicoechea, and some 40 men. They are gradually joined by civilians armed with shovels, pitchforks, and hoes. This makeshift battalion takes the road to the artillery park of Monteleón, in the spot which is now the Plaza del 2 de Mayo. Women were also leading players in the insurrection.
In those spontaneous, ill-prepared uprisings, women were a constant presence. The same is true of other uprisings in Europe. In the case of the May 2nd uprising in Madrid, it was possible that the local women, there were perhaps 30,000 young women, had suffered the abuses of the 30,000 French soldiers.
For the first time, women are identified by their names and surnames. This is not only because they were quite fierce, in fact, I think they have always been fierce women, but because for the first time we have a list of women with names and surnames which stand out in a truly unique and important way.
Names like Manuela Malasaña and Clara del Rey have survived the passage of time. But there were many women who tackled the French soldiers at street level and from the rooftops. The face-off between the Imperial Army and the people of Madrid was one of cannons versus flower pots. The French mark the doors of the houses whose owners have attacked them. When the struggle ends, punishment squads go in search of those responsible. They will be imprisoned and taken to the barracks, where they will be judged en masse, with no guarantee of fairness or justice. Overwhelmed by what has taken place, the Regents' Council makes a new announcement demanding that the people of Madrid cease to revolt. But it is already too late. The entire city is at war. At the Puerta del Sol, a confrontation takes place which will be captured in the painting by Francisco de Goya, The Charge of the Mamelukes. The painting illustrates the violence of the clash between the Mamelukes of the French Cavalry Corps and the people of Madrid, who were put to the sword by these armed horsemen. In the royal prison, something unbelievable is taking place. The prisoners ask if they can leave in order to help kill the French, and they promise to come back. Most surprisingly, they keep their word. 51 of the 56 prisoners return to their cells the following day. Of the 5 who do not come back, 3 are assumed dead, another is gravely wounded, and the 5th is never heard from again. In less than 4 hours, Murat mobilized an army of 30,000 men. Soldiers stationed on the outskirts of Madrid in such barracks as Casa de Campo, Carabancheles, and El Pardo enter the city ready to restore order. But even though the revolt will not continue much longer, the rebels are still prepared to fight. News travels of the Spanish army's desperate resistance in the barracks at Monteleon. Locals who still have weapons and enough strength join Captain Pedro Velarde's men. They prepare for the final battle. In other parts of the city, Imperial troops have restored order, and they begin to detain the rebels. The final battle takes place at the Monteleon barracks. The group of Spanish soldiers and civilians there has resisted various attacks. But their ammunition is running out, and their cannon, dug in under the archway in the entrance, is only shooting shrapnel at this point. Daoiz and Velarde refuse to consider surrender, although they are aware that there is no way out. Finally, Colonel Lagrange gives the order. 1,800 men from the 6th Infantry Regiment form a line of attack and crush the insurrection. In 1869, the old Monteleon artillery park was demolished. Only the entrance archway remains, the central element in today's Plaza del 2 de Mayo. Under the arch, this monument pays tribute to Luis Daoiz, Pedro Velarde, and all the citizens of Madrid who were here for that date with destiny on the morning of May 2nd, 1808.
The French, the adversaries, actually have the best account with respect to the Spanish combatants. Not only guerrillas, but more especially Spanish soldiers who followed the acts of treason from their regiments, refusing to surrender. The French could not understand how, when the battle was lost, they didn't just raise the white flag. They even insisted on honorable terms for the surrender and fought to the finish.
The deaths of Daoiz and Velarde caused a great commotion and was captured in numerous paintings and engravings in the 19th century, like this triumphal funeral carriage by Josep Ribelles. As night falls on May the 2nd, detentions begin of all locals suspected of having participated in the day's events. The French army takes stock of its casualties and gathers its dead from the streets. Payback will not have to wait. Years later, a great artist would paint the image that would immortalize the sad early morning hours of May the 3rd. Whoa! This monument stands on the Paseo del Prado in Madrid. It honors all Spanish citizens who died on that spring day 200 years ago. The number of victims varies depending on the source. It is thought that more than 400 Spaniards died, 90% of whom were civilians. French casualties were calculated by the invaders themselves, and as is usually the case, politics casts a shadow of self-interest over the numbers and facts.
When measuring the quantitative importance of Spanish casualties, there is a great disparity. The number of victims ranges from about 2,000 to about 10,000. When it comes to French casualties, though, they seem to be wildly underestimated. The first numbers were drawn from a letter sent to Paris, which speaks of only about 25 French dead.
In the Plaza del Rey de Madrid, we find this monument to Lieutenant Ruiz. He was in charge of handing out weapons to civilians in the barracks of Monteleon. His image symbolizes the union between the civilians and soldiers who rose up against the French on May 2nd, and who continued fighting even after that date until the last French soldier had crossed the Pyrenees. May 2nd was the start of the Peninsular War. In his print series, The Disasters of War, Goya captured the violence and hate that had spread throughout Spain. Spanish troops had fewer arms and supplies than the French, but with the help of the people, they triumphed. Rich and poor, clergy and laypeople, noblemen and commoners came together to drive out the invaders. From among their ranks came a group of celebrated fighters, the guerrillas. They attacked French soldiers tirelessly, laying the groundwork for the modern form of guerrilla warfare. That makeshift army, headed up by men like Espoza and Mina, the Empecinado and El Cura Merino, caused thousands of casualties for the enemy. Most importantly, they destroyed French morale.
I believe that Napoleon underestimated, or wasn't familiar enough with, the Spanish people's capacity for resistance. He thought crossing Spain was effectively going to be a triumphal march, much like it had been in other parts of Europe. But the Spanish already had a sense of national community. They felt they were part of what would later be a nation. They were going to rise up like no other place in Europe had risen up. Napoleon acknowledged this when he withdrew from Santa Elena, saying that the Spanish masses had behaved honorably.
Napoleon asserted that Spain was a bunch of bumpkins led by a bunch of priests. His own brother Joseph I warned him in a letter that he was mistaken and that his glory would meet its end in Spain.
That doomed, disastrous, catastrophic Spanish campaign would undoubtedly mean the decline of Napoleonic power and the downfall of the regime.
Following the Battle of Baylen, Napoleon's first defeat, the opinion held by French troops could be summed up like this: fortune for the generals, ruin for the officials, death for the soldiers.
Napoleon first began to experience defeat in Spain, and these were defeats that showed the international community that Napoleon was not invincible. Rather, that the great Napoleonic army was vulnerable. I think this was the value of the Peninsular War and of the riots in Madrid, and of all the uprisings that took place against Napoleon in Spain.
I think now that history has toned down the role played by the Spanish army. We have to remember that Baylen, significant because we won in that July battle, caused a stir throughout Europe. That was the first time that Napoleon's army had been defeated. It showed that Napoleon was not invincible. It was terribly symbolic. The fact that the victory was achieved by the Spanish army together with armed civilians, that they rose up spontaneously, but were also driven to it by an invasion.
Beyond a material dimension, the 2nd of May became a spiritual milestone. It served as an example for the insurrection that spread throughout the country in the weeks that followed. And from a political point of view, it planted a seed for the construction of a new kind of nation, which began to come together institutionally with the supreme central governing body for the kingdom, which met in Aranjuez on September 25, 1808.
Facts and statistics explain what happened, but they cannot tell the story of the emotions that filled the hearts of every citizen of Madrid who rose up against the French.
The Spanish people, starting in Madrid, in Móstoles, rose up against the invading army because they felt like a nation. And that led to a constitution, the Constitution of Cádiz in 1812. For the first time, sovereignty was given to the people. That is to say, for the first time, the people had the power to make decisions about Spain. The first liberal constitution in the world was the Constitution of Cádiz. It was called La Pepa because it was approved on March 19th.
It all happened 200 years ago. The Spain we know today is the result of the hard work and sacrifice of these people and of other heroes too often forgotten.